Women's rights in the United States have come a long way since colonies migrated to America. It all started in 1769 when the colonies agreed to adopt the English system, decreeing that women could not own property in their own name or keep any of their own earnings. In 1777, all states passed laws which take away any woman's right to vote. About 100 years later, in 1848, at Seneca Falls, New York, 300 women and men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, a plea for the end of discrimination against women. In 1866, the 14th Amendment is passed by Congress, with citizens and voters defined as male in the Constitution. In 1872, Victoria Claflin Woodhull becomes the first female presidential candidate in the United States, nominated by the National Radical Reformers. 1 year later, in 1873, the Supreme Court rules that a state has the right to exclude a married woman from practicing law. And in 1887, Susanna Medora Salter becomes the first woman elected mayor of Americantown in Argonia, Kansas. 1890, the first state, Wyoming, grants women the right to vote in all elections. But in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, ensuring the women the right to vote. 1923, the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment is introduced. It says men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. 40 years later, in 1963, the Equal Pay Act is finally passed by Congress, promising equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex of the worker. 1 year later, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act passes, prohibiting sex discrimination in employment. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is created. In 1975, the Supreme Court denies states the right to exclude women from juries. And just 6 years later, Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro becomes the first woman to be nominated to be vice president on a major party ticket. The state of Mississippi belatedly ratifies the 19th Amendment, finally granting women the right to vote. Let that sink in. It wasn't until 1984 that every state had legally allowed women the right to vote. 1997, Madeleine Albright becomes the first female Secretary of State. 2007, Nancy Pelosi becomes the first female Speaker of the House. And in 2008, Alaska Governor Sarah Palin becomes the first woman to run for vice president on a Republican ticket. Hillary Clinton loses the Democratic nomination to Barack Obama. In 2016, Hillary Rodham Clinton secures the Democratic presidential nomination, becoming the first U.S. woman to lead the ticket of a major party. She loses to Republican Donald Trump in the fall. 2017, Congress has a record number of women, with 104 female House members and 21 female senators, including the chamber's first Latina Nevada Senator, Catherine Cortez Masto. And so, how do the women today feel about their rights? Do they feel they have equal rights? Where do they see women's rights going in the future? And how can we get there?
Hi, I'm here with my mother and Astound designer Denise Deschone. And we were just chatting about women's rights and feminism and what that means today. And so, Denise, when did you first realize that you were interested in design and pursuing that?
I think at a very young age. I was probably about 5 when I really started to learn and enjoy art in general. And I think from there, it stemmed to design. So I've been sketching, drawing, and appreciating art and nature from a very young age. So.
And what were gender norms and rights like when you first started getting into college and starting a business?
Yeah, very difficult. When I first started, the idea that I wanted to be an architect, I think it was less than 1% of females were getting into architectural school at the time. And so I had a counselor actually tell me, oh, you shouldn't be an architect, you need to be an interior designer, which I thought was very different because as much as I love interior design and it is very much a part of what I do, I wanted to build buildings. And so being very young and sort of naive at the time, I went into interior design to begin with, and though it was somewhat rewarding, I was still feeling like I was missing something, and I wanted to build buildings. And so went back to school after finishing interior design school and got into architectural school. And at the time, I would say in my entire class, there were 15 women. And when I graduated, there were only 2 of us. I remember specifically in a jury, which is when we present work that we do for that semester based on a project that we have to do. All the men who were presenting were to other men architects who were the jurors. There was a different camaraderie going on. And I do remember being very tired because we were pulling all-nighters to present these huge projects in design. And I remember one of the jurors telling me once, listen, babe, you better get used to it, that's architecture. Talking about just, because I had made a comment that I was, exhausted from all the work. And he wouldn't have spoken to anyone else, nor did he in the jury that way. And so I started to realize at that point that I was in a field that most women weren't in yet, and that my journey was going to be really difficult. And the same with the workforce. I'd go on to, we were doing high rises at the time, and I would go on to a job force, and people would automatically assume that I was the secretary or the receptionist, and not really realizing that I was actually the person building the building and being in charge. So, and it exists still today, to some extent. It's gotten better though.
I'm glad to hear that. But are there any examples of moments where you knew that you grew from those moments?
I think all of them you grow from. You take something away each time something like that happens. And I feel as a female, if I can make it a little better for someone coming up to stand on my shoulders to get a little higher, that's my job.
That's beautiful. And what is your perspective on gender norms and women's rights now?
Again, it's whatever I can do to, I always believe in best person for the job, regardless of gender. Mm-hmm. But if I can raise up females, I will. It's my job. I think for the longest time, we have been put into a box of, and had that experience, obviously, with my personal career and seeing it firsthand. And whenever we can lift someone up, we should lift them up, and even better if it's a female.
Is there any place that you think we have room for improvement, or is there a certain thing you want to see, a certain place you want to see women's rights go?
It's such a loaded question with all of the Me Too movement, and I've thought about it a lot recently. And having both girls and I have a son, I try to look at the perspective of both sides of what's going on in the world today. And though I feel like women, equal right, equal pay, equal education, all of those things are important to everybody, I wouldn't want us as a gender, as a female gender, to lose sight that our male counterparts are just as important. However, we do have to fight harder to be equal in a lot of things that we do, and they need to also look at it from that perspective of that everyone should, that's performing, everyone that has equal education and rights, those are givens to all of us. We should all be afforded those luxuries or rights, regardless of who we are and where we come from and what we do. And I think if we can keep as females in perspective and not lose sight that every little thing is an issue and look at the bigger issues at hand, And for me, those are obviously education. And I think that's where we need to lean our perspective, in those things. And I think it will then eventually flow over into the workplace, and not be so finger pointing to our male counterparts of every little thing they do. We need to educate everyone on differences.
Right. I agree. Equal rights for everybody.
That's right.
Woo!